Thank you.
All right, you guys, as everyone loads on, I just want to say thank you all for being here. If you do have any questions during today's webinar, please use the chat feature, and we will do our best to answer those questions. As well as if you are seeking CLE credit, you must answer all 3 polling questions, which are dispersed randomly throughout the webinar, as well as to stay on for the entirety of the hour for the webinar. You must submit those answers when the poll is live. And if the poll closes and you are not able to submit, you will unfortunately not be able to get credit. So please make sure you are paying attention. And just a reminder that this webinar is only going to be for CLE. CE credit will not be available, and we apologize for the inconvenience. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Yogi.
Thank you, Madison. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. We do appreciate it. I'm Yogi Letvis, Constangy Cyber's Director of Business Development, and I'll be helping to guide today's session. Today's session is focused on stages of cybersecurity that often determine the long-term impact of an incident, the post-incident phase. While much attention is given to the detection and response, what happens after the incident is just as critical, shaping recovery, regulatory outcomes, and future resilience. We are joined by 2 highly experienced leaders in this space today. First up is Chris Lombardozzi, who is the Managing Director at Booz Allen Hamilton's Incident Response Practice. With over a decade of experience in cyber investigations across public and private sectors, he has led global incident response efforts, helping organizations recover from complex cyber threats and build resilience. A retired law enforcement professional, he brings deep expertise in cybercrime and forensics analysis. Outside of work, you can find Chris enjoying boating, fishing, and capturing the great outdoors through photography. Chris, thank you for joining us today. Alongside him is Hoar, partner at Constangy and the chair of our National Cyber Team. With over 25 years of experience in data privacy and information security, a former DOJ cyber attorney and lead prosecutor in Oregon, he worked closely with agencies like the FBI and the Secret Service on complex cybercrime cases. Today, he is a recognized leader in data breach response and cybersecurity, helping organizations navigate incidents and manage cyber risk. And if you do get a chance to chat with him, he might even share with you that a lot of what he's learned about teamwork and resilience actually started long before his legal career while he was working as a logger in the Pacific Northwest. Very interesting conversation. Sean, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Yogi. I appreciate those. I appreciate the introduction. And I feel very fortunate to be here this afternoon, wherever some might be, or this morning, wherever you might be, because Chris and I have had the opportunity to work together, and I've been the beneficiary of his tremendous insights, his work ethic, his experiential, I think you call it, yes, experiential insight based upon everything he has done in his private public sector career, and that he brings to bear in these matters. He and I particularly have had a number of what we call after action sessions with clients, where we really tried to look at everything that was learned during the process and talk about best practices moving forward to mitigate the risk that anything that may have occurred previously would ever happen again. And I've always found that to be tremendously beneficial. And I'm the beneficiary of Chris's experience in that process. So I'm going to walk through a number of slides right now. We're going to have a polling question shortly, but to get started, I'm going to talk through some of the organizational questions that we want to ask in that after action report, after action session, the lessons learned session. And then after I walk through some of the organizational decisions, then Chris is really going to drill down on the information security topics that we want to cover in that after action or lessons learned session. But the bottom line is we're here to talk about a critical phase of the data security incident lifecycle. Cybersecurity frameworks typically identify 6 or 7 phases of a data security incident lifecycle. It begins with preparation, and then at some point there's the detection. Because of what you prepared for, you're going to be able to detect that something has occurred. And then once you detect, you'll analyze it to get a feel for what the impact might be. And then to the extent that it's malicious, you want to contain it to make sure you mitigate the harm that it's causing to your environment. And then once you're deep into it, you want to eradicate any malicious artifacts that might reside in the system to make sure that it's a healthy network moving forward. And then with that process becomes a recovery of operations and doing your analysis, meeting your legal obligations, et cetera. And then once all that's done, you're on the other side of the incident. Then you sit down, take a deep breath, look at what happened, how it happened, and what we can do to make sure we never have to experience that again. And so that's just much like things in life. When you have a certain experience, want to take a couple moments at the very least, take a deep breath, identify what it was, how it happened, and if it wasn't the highlight of your life, probably want to assess how we can mitigate the risk that it would ever happen again. Next slide, Miss Madison. So a couple of the first questions, right off the top, we just want to say what happened, really talk about at a high level what happened, and then at the very least, right at the outset, could it have been prevented? Sometimes it's going to be real clear that maybe there was a security control that failed, maybe a certain service that you thought was engaged wasn't, and it's real clear. Sometimes, even though you do a very thorough analysis, you're going to come to the conclusion that perhaps we couldn't have because it was a zero-day event, a brand new piece of technology or software or exploit launched by a malicious criminal, and that's okay if you couldn't. But let's really look about that. If it could have been prevented, how could it have been prevented? Were there administrative, physical, or technical controls that could have helped prevent the incident? What were they? How could a people, processes, and products that we had in place could that possibly have prevented it? Have changes been made to prevent it in the future? And so we want to jump right into that, and then we want to talk about the response. Could we have responded more quickly, more efficiently, more effectively? Did the system at the outset, for instance, give us immediate response? And that's one of the first things we're going to ask when we hop on an assessment call is, how did you learn about this? What did you detect? That's going to give you some indication as to what may have been touched, may have been impacted. And that's also going to be one of the first questions we asked in the after action session is, how did this come about? Was it effective? Do we have to think about how better to inform ourselves moving forward? Did the alert cause an immediate response? Or was it something that landed at your help desk and didn't get responded to over the weekend because that's staffed 8 to 5? And sometimes you'll say that's crazy. How could that happen? But sometimes that's a problem at the outset with just how the information technology and security individuals are actually alerted to issues in the system, whether it's an internal alert or sometimes it's an external alert. And if there are any changes need to be made to the learning process, what are those changes? And sometimes it's systemic, sometimes it's a matter of just personnel shifting or maybe product configuration. But we want to make sure we identify those various things at the outset. Literally, how do we learn about this thing to make sure that in the future we can learn about it very effectively and efficiently? Next slide. First polling question. Madison?
First question. How prepared is your organization for post-incident lessons learned phase? Very prepared. We have a formal process. Somewhat prepared, informal or inconsistent process. Not prepared. We focus mainly on response, not reflection, or unsure. We have about 90 seconds on these poll questions, so please get those answers in quickly. So once again, that was, how prepared is your organization for the post-incident lesson learned phase? Very prepared. We have a formal process. Somewhat prepared, informal or inconsistent process, or not prepared. We focus mostly on response, not reflection, or unsure.
And don't worry, you're not going to be tested. However, some of the jurisdictions you come from require us to have these polling questions to show that you actively participated in the webinar. So you actually have to complete this to get your credit. So go ahead and, even if you're not quite sure, if you're a perfectionist like me and it's kind of hard, kind of analytical, go ahead and give us a shot anyway.
And we're going to take about 5 more seconds here. So make sure to get those answers in. And after I close the poll, I will share our answers just so we have an idea of where we landed. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it.
Well, it's great that probably 50+% of the participants believe they're very prepared. That's awesome. And then the others, we've always got work to do. It's always an evolving process. And so once we get through the next kind of layer of questions we're going to talk about is literally looking at from an incident response plan perspective. Did we have the right internal responders identified and available? Sometimes incident response plans get put on a shelf, and sometimes personnel change. And when you need to actually respond, maybe the cell phone we have isn't the right one. Maybe we realize we've got to dig a little deeper. We want to make sure we identify our internal responders. Want to make sure that we've got the appropriate responsive technological resources available to us. And that then sometimes brings up that economic protection, perhaps through cyber insurance coverage. Did you have the right product? And through that, did you identify sufficient financial resources available and technical resources to respond to? Did you have appropriate external responders identified and available? As an example, we recommend proactively that you identify a go-to forensics firms, and we engage them at the master services agreement under privilege, and even they can do some proactive work, but they're always going to be there for you to if you need them in a crisis. And we typically will identify a preferred provider of your cyber insurer to make sure that everyone's aligned with who's vetted and well suited to help you respond to the matter. But we want to go through and make sure that we have the right internal, right external responders, and if we have to adjust anything, now's the time for us to identify that and make some changes. And with regard to external responders, sometimes it's additional external responsive technological resources. For instance, we're seeing enhanced AI attacks these days, and sometimes we need actually some extra resources to protect external IP addresses versus personnel doing more of a forensics perspective. So we want to make sure that we identify the external resources, and if in fact we need them long term, what are those long term, and how can we best facilitate that contract to make sure it's the most efficient and effective for the client? Was the timing of our response appropriate? Did we have some lag time because maybe alerts weren't there, personnel weren't there, responders weren't there, or were you right on top of it and we did everything we wanted to? Did you allocate the resources so that the entire incident response team shared responsibilities? And that's all process of it. Initially, kind of that triage, identifying what the tasks that need to be completed, and then those who are going to own those tasks. And we typically, as a matter of protocol in a crisis, like maybe a ransomware attack, where you know you're impacted through encryption, you're probably impacted through exfiltration, but maybe you don't know that yet. And what we want to do is set up what we call cadence calls, probably early in the day and late in the day. And that first call is going to identify all those tasks that need to be completed to get you operational, as well as other things to get you operational, but get you secure, identify any notification obligations, et cetera. But we're going to identify all those tasks that can be accomplished, say, within the next 12 hours, as well as the longer term tasks. And then we're going to have another cadence call 12 hours later and check to make sure those that needed to get done did get done. And if not, what remained to get done. And then what is going to get accomplished in the next 12 hours. And then we rinse and repeat, if you will. But every day we're checking off those tasks that need to be accomplished, making sure we've got somebody who owns those responsibilities. And then by 48 hours, 72 hours, 96 hours, et cetera, you're substantially improving your health, your response, the operations, et cetera. But it's really critical for us to identify all those tasks that need to be accomplished and then properly allocate the resources to own those tasks to get it done. And that's all goes back to, do we schedule the right cadence calls? Too much, too little? Did you keep all the stakeholders adequately informed? The last thing that executives want, or boards want perhaps, are to be surprised. The last thing they want is to hear it from a third party. So we want to make sure, as part of the incident response planning process, we identify who needs to be communicated with, who needs to be part of the incident response process, but who needs to be a liaison to the executive suite, who needs to be a liaison to the board or any oversight process. Did you appropriately communicate with all the employees if something happened? To the extent you have an encryption attack, obviously the employees are not going to be able to access data. And so it's going to be critical that we try to inform them at the outset that we've had an incident, a disruption in the network. We're investigating, and as soon as we have developments, we'll let you know. And sometimes ahead of time in a larger organization, we might have to figure out a different, what we call out-of-band communication to employees, or some other means to communicate with employees if certain parts of your system or your data are locked down, meaning they're not available due to encryption. But that's always going to be a process. Do we communicate properly with employees? And then, to the extent that clients were affected, did you appropriately communicate with? And if you didn't, what went wrong and how can we correct it for the future. As an example, in our incident response planning process, we typically will have holding statements for internal communication with employees that all will be customized to the type of incident. Similarly, we have holding statements for communication with clients and it's going to be customized again to the nature of the incident. And part of that's going to be based upon contractual obligations, and that will probably be covered in the next couple of slides. But the communication is going to be part of this as well. We want to make sure somebody owns those tasks, and they're working with the internal marketing and communications team, and sometimes outside forensics firms. And then at some point, the key is here, obviously, to identify the affected systems. Sometimes you're going to know up front what happened because the data that's not available is going to be tied to certain servers, certain applications. But sometimes, and oftentimes, you're not able to identify precisely what was affected until you get deep in the forensics investigation. And so we're going to talk about that, where we're able to immediately identify the affected systems. And this is a key part of it. And Chris and I have been through a number of instances where we ask about the asset inventory. Do you have an asset inventory so we know what your network is comprised of to make sure we're able to identify what may have been impacted. And quite frankly, there are oftentimes situations where the organization does not have a complete asset inventory. They actually don't know exactly what comprises their network. And it makes it just a bit more difficult when we try to get them operational because they don't know exactly what's been impacted. And sometimes it's also harder for us to push out certain what we call digital agents, endpoint detection response tools to contain the malicious activity if we don't know through identified assets and devices, what that entire network actually is. So that's going to be a key thing. We're going to ask about that, make sure we've got a full asset inventory at the other side of this of the incident to make sure we never have to deal with that again if, in fact, it wasn't completely accurate at the outset. And then we want to make sure we identify the affected data on the systems. And one of the first things we're going to ask, of course, is the data that you have, can you identify which devices hold that data? I mean, were they accurately and adequately mapped to various systems? And if not, that's a whole nother project we're going to get to, because oftentimes when you have encrypted data, we want to make sure we identify the priority data that you need to get operational, or that priority data that actually triggers certain obligations to clients. And we need to know where that data is to understand what may have been impacted. And so we're going to talk about the timing of that, and whether or not there was actually a priority, maybe a priority tree, with, if you will, whether it's in your incident response plan or your topographical, your organizational chart within your information security system, just to make sure that when you look at the network diagram, you know where the key data is, what you need to make sure you're always keeping it secure. And if those devices are impacted, we know what data was on them.
Sean, just a quick question. What platform have you seen or do you suggest for out of environment communications to staff if email is not an option? And I know you could dig deep here, but do you have one or two off the top of your head that you've seen, or how have people done it?
I'm going to follow up with that after. There are a number of them, and I'm always hesitant to recommend one product over another. I want to be very careful. There's some arenas that are it's a little easier to do that, but I've got three in mind, and I'll follow up in writing with those if that makes sense. But Chris, I don't know if you've got at least three that you can provide, or if we should.
Yeah, I would say it would be difficult to find a situation where maybe email was completely out of the question. I know that is a possibility. When it comes to some of these broader communications, for us as the incident responders, we always want to ensure that, to the extent possible, any communications are protected under the attorney-client privilege, and by extension, having breach coach as part of those communications is paramount for us. So any communication that we can have them on platforms is going to be best, even if it's a personally owned device that has no connection to the network whatsoever, your cell phone, tablet, or what have you. But we technically would prefer the email. But again, I don't want to get into specific vendors.
No, and the reason I hesitate about Yogi, very seldom do we actually rely upon those external systems, in part because oftentimes they don't necessarily solve the complete issue with current communication, and they're not as functional as we want them to be in actually responding to the incident itself. Sometimes it's basically a layer of communication to communicate a message to certain stakeholders, but it's not something you can rely upon for the actual incident response. So I want to be very careful about what I'm answering to make sure it's completely accurate. I know there are some portals that are out in the marketplace right now that certain entities recommend to be used to store data and communicate through them. Quite frankly, some can be very clunky. and can sometimes be somewhat seem like an impediment to the process. So I want to be careful about that too, because some may be good, some may be not quite as good. I want to be careful about what we recommend. But like Chris said, believe it or not, oftentimes what we do is we go to maybe a certain Gmail suite, or excuse me, email suite. Sometimes it may be Gmail, maybe another product that we ultimately have a naming convention that's unique to the incident itself. Because one thing we don't want if we're using an out-of-band email is we don't want you to use your personal email, because if the matter ultimately ends up in litigation, anything in that personal email might become discoverable in that litigation. So we want to make sure that if there is email communication, we set up a separate email suite out of band, out of the corporate domain. We want to make sure it's specific to this incident, so there's no communication about anything other than this incident. And so it's be under privilege, and at some point, if we actually need to discover it, you know exactly what it contains, and it doesn't contain anything personal. But we typically can spin those things up in minutes, and then we communicate through the calendar invites are sent to get that out-of-bound email, and the communication for forensics, and one thread, a separate thread probably for threat actor communication. And typically that's the way we handle it in 99% of matters.
Thank you.
Next slide. And this is a key thing right here. One of the things we do, we've actually, as some of you know, published a 500+ page book called the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Desktop Reference, where we actually identify all the data breach notification statutes, as well as data privacy legislation that's relevant to this. And so we're constantly looking as we're going through the data security response for consumer and regulatory notification obligations and contractual notification obligations. And so when we look through that, we're looking at where the sensitive and personal and proprietary data affected, and if so, what's the extent of that, and what do we have to do? In terms of sensitive data, as soon as we detect the incident, we've got to be very careful, because the statutes typically say you've got to notify those whose personal information may have been acquired without authorization within 30 days of detection. And the challenge with if anybody's ever been through a forensics investigation, sometimes that 30 days can be exhausted rather quickly. And it seems like 24-hour period goes by, and all of a sudden you wake up and 14 days later, and you still haven't completely analyzed what data has been affected. So typically what we try to run as quickly as we can to identify that sensitive data that's been affected. And then as soon as we do, then we try to start that notification process, get ready, ramped up, quickly, so we can try to do it within 30 days. But quite frankly, oftentimes we're not able to. And so what we try to do, though, is make sure we clearly notify those who've been affected within 30 days of identifying the actual data that was acquired without authorization. But just know that the timing of that identification is critical, and we want to make sure that if we're preparing for something in the future as a result of the after action session, we're identifying again where that sensitive data is located, to make sure that in the future, if something does happen, we can identify it as quickly as possible to make sure we comply with all our statutory, regulatory, and contractual obligations. And with that, it's really helpful up front. If you have contracts, to make sure you've got a system up front to identify any notification provisions in those contracts. And sometimes you've got a dozen contracts. Sometimes you have 1,000 contracts, and it's really helpful if up front you have maybe just a simple spreadsheet where identify the contracts, identify per client, identify any notification provisions for if confidential information has been acquired. If you have a notification obligation because of a data security incident, what that incident definition might be, because some are very broad, some can be narrow, and then what data sets might be affected if in fact the definition of a data security incident is governed by the type of data that has been affected. But identify those provisions that are relevant to that, put them in a spreadsheet so you can quickly identify it, and you want to keep a hard copy of that, because if that gets encrypted, you're not going to have access to all the work you've done to create your contract management system. But you want to make sure we identify all those contracts to make sure we identify any notification obligations. And the reason that is so important is oftentimes more liability emanates from those contractual obligations than from maybe statutory or regulatory obligations. And depending on the nature of your business and the sectors you're in, sometimes you got very high fines if you don't comply with those notification obligations. So we want to make sure that if we need to notify a client within 24 hours or quote unquote immediately after detecting a data security incident, we actually have the ability to do so. key thing here, we got to maintain, we got to be, manage the project very astutely from a financial perspective. And we want to make sure, to the extent you have cyber insurance, that every expense that you know you're going to incur, we have prior approval before you spend a dime on it. And that's typically your outside counsel should play the role of a project manager to make sure that any statement work at the outset for a forensics firm or threat actor communicator, network restoration engineers, public relations, all of those statements of work, actually, we get it properly scoped. We identify what it's going to take in terms of cost and time. We have that approved by the cyber insurance carrier before any of those contracts are executed. But then once you're executed, then you launch that. But we maintain the budgets, and then we know what the expected budgets are. The cyber insurance carrier can actually set aside those reserves to make sure they're at the outset can estimate what the cost of this claim is likely going to be to make sure they've got the proper reserves set aside. So it's going to be incumbent upon the outside counsel to be the project manager, making sure that happens. And for the client to make sure everybody knows that if you've got a third party kind of working in the wings or the background to support your information technology or security staff, that we know about them, because sometimes those expenses can also be approved, sometimes not if they're in the regular course. But we want to make sure we're aware of that, so at least we can identify those that might be possibly approved by your carrier, and at the very least look at the total budget with regard to all the expenses in this matter, and then we can manage it appropriately. And then we're going to get into security controls and trying to look at what we had in place and what can be done better. We're going to look at your backup systems. Were they affected? Did they work well? What can be done in the future to make sure that they aren't corrupted in the future? Multi-factor authentication, was it accurately and adequately deployed? Your endpoint detection and response tool, which one did you have? Did it work properly? Was it misconfigured, right? Your firewalls. Right now, we've got I guess historically a lot of issues with different types of firewalls, making sure they're properly versioned, properly configured, because if not, it only takes one mistake and the bad guys will come right through. We want to make sure that if you're coming in through your VPN, that it's properly protected as well, and their email platform is properly protected. All these things are critical component parts to the security of your system, and typically one or more of these are going to be attack vectors. And so we want to make sure we do a thorough review, and then moving forward, mitigate the risk that any of those will be adversely affected down the road. Next slide. Notification obligations. I won't spend too much time on that. I already covered a lot of it, but that's going to be critical to make sure did we identify them? And if we determine that we didn't have any notification obligations, whether it be contractual, statutorily, or statutory or regulatory, have we provided a breach risk assessment showing what the facts of the matter were, a legal analysis as to why you have a reasonable basis to believe that you did not have any consumer, regulatory, or contractual obligations, and make sure we have that in place as well, so you have peace of mind and you know you've got the legal opinion in your back pocket should you have to defend yourself and down the road. But any decision that's made with regard to the lack of those obligations should clearly be written and defensible, so you don't have to worry about it moving forward. And after all this is said and done, what kind of changes do we have to make to our incident response plan? And who's going to make them? When do they get made? And how often are we going to review this stuff? With regard to information security policies, do we have to change some of those? Do we have to enhance some of those? Who's going to make them? When are they going to be made? And how often we're going to review them? And then do we have any other changes to make in our personnel? Do we have adequate personnel to staff our information security program? It's becoming ever more a critical part of a business model. We want to make sure we allocate the proper amount of resources, not just the technology and the tools, but to the people. Did you have the right processes, technologies, and again, policies in place to make sure that you've got a more secure network today than you did before? Polling question number 2, Mr. Yogi.
Question is, following a cyber incident, what is typically your biggest gap? Single choice on this one. First choice is speed of response. Second choice is internal coordination, communication. Third choice is identifying affected system and data. And the last choice is access to the right external partners, forensics, legal, etc. Poll question number 2, following a cyber incident, what is typically your biggest gap? Speed of response, internal coordination, communications, identifying affected systems and data, or access to the right external partners.
Make sure that you guys are answering the polling question on the screen and not in the chat. Otherwise, it will not be logged. And we'll take about 5 more seconds here. All righty.
Those are great responses, and it's oftentimes I think that probably consistent with what Chris and I have experienced as well. And I don't see the responses in front of me, but I think part of it was really identifying the effective systems and data, which I think most of you responded. That was probably the one gap, and that's always probably the most challenging part of responding to a data security incident. In part because the bad guys are trying their best to do, the anti-forensics and delete some of the event logs that would otherwise help us identify what occurred. So it's much more difficult moving forward. But one of the reasons we're here today is that it really begins and it ends with preparation. The first phase of any data security incident lifecycle is preparation. And the last is lessons learned in order to prepare for the future. And so these are just general areas. And then we're going to jump into some very detailed security controls we want you to talk about. But first, first and last phase of the data security incident lifecycle is first review and revise the information security program. What about our program is working, right? And maybe do we enhance it? What about it isn't? And what do we need to do to get it back on track or get it on track? Identify and deploy people, process, and technology. And part of this is maybe a security risk assessment. I actually recommend as an annual foundation for an information security program, an annual security risk assessment. And that's really looking at the operational configuration of your controls, making sure they're all properly configured and working properly, and making sure your paperwork's in order, that your policies are up to date, and that your incident response plan is up to date. All of those should be part of an annual risk assessment. And that's part of what this after action process can actually help accelerate. Incident response plan, making sure you've got that in place, completely up to date. Policies in place, completely up to date. And then at some point on an annual basis, and I know some organizations, I work with them to do quarterly tabletop exercises, different types of tabletop exercise. But we recommend at least one cross-functional where you have leaders of all the basic business units, not just information technology and security, but everybody who's going to be a manager of a business unit come together to do a tabletop exercise and come up with a most recent exploit that could be dangerous to your business model, and make sure we walk through the organizational decisions that you as an organization and leaders of those business units will have to make to get from one side to the other side of that incident. And so this is one of those things where when you come out of this process, put that on the calendar and plan for it to make sure it becomes part and baked into your information security program. And then as part of this whole process, make sure that, obviously, if you did have a cyber insurance policy, you're probably very thankful, and you want to make sure that you're in place, for that renewal. Quite frankly, from my perspective, you're going to be a much better underwriting risk. Listen to that, underwriters out there, a much better underwriting risk if you actually after having gone through this incident, because now the vulnerabilities that may have previously existed that we're now aware of are shored up and secured, and you're a much more secure environment than you ever have been before. But it's time now to prepare for that renewal and get a feel for how this incident will affect that, but also make sure you're able to put your best foot forward and identify the health of your system now, because that's what you can actually use to actually accelerate that renewal process. Chris?
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. One of the biggest factors that I think we see from the incident response side, centric to the insurance policies, is keeping those policies off of your file servers and in a very secure and locked down place. There's so many times where we get engaged for ransomware attacks, and the threat actors come out and say, hey, just so we're clear, we have access to your policy. We know everything that it says. We're not going to negotiate. Here's what we want. Make it happen. So that can be a big player in some of those after action reports, is where are we actually keeping that information? Where are we going to store that policy? Should it live on the server? Is it easily accessible? Who in the company has access to that? And is it going to be accessible to a threat actor to the extent that an attack does happen? Big concern there from the cybersecurity perspective. So with that, thanks, Sean. That was a lot of really good information to help prep for talks about preparation, post incident and after action reports. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of NIST topics and kind of working through achieving remediation and where we should be in the beginning and kind of some of the thoughts that we should have after. So obviously, having a secure cybersecurity governance and risk management policy overall is going to be very important. But where do you fall in terms of the overall view? There are things that can be done in anticipation of being prepared. When it comes down to looking at what your overall policies are like, having attack surface reduction management in place. Attack surface reduction, essentially meaning from the outside, peeking in, getting deep into the network, not just surface or domain level, but looking into what potential opportunities there are for a threat actor to come in. As part of that, there's typically a lot of hardening that can be identified if there's gaps in multi-factor, if multi-factor is enabled in places in the environment as opposed to being enforced. Enforced meaning where your end users essentially don't have the opportunity or a selection of whether or not they're going to play with the MFA roles. When it comes to hardening as well, multi-factor is going to be just as important as things like endpoint detection and response. And that's a solution that we recommend to anybody, whether they're facing a cyber incident or not. In terms of some of the vulnerabilities that Sean mentioned, a lot of these EDR tools even have the capability to do at least high-level vulnerability scans to determine, what operating systems are in play across the network, what particular softwares might have vulnerabilities, and to what extent are they critical? Are they low level? Where do they need to be covered? When we talk about, detection and response, some of that involves identity and access. Does perhaps you're in a school or a school district? Do the cafeteria folks need to have access to student education records? Locking those things down to where only specific users have availability to access certain things, most importantly, in certain places, managing, and enforcing least privilege, authentication, and then Sean talked a little bit about the EDR side when we talk about the enhanced detection and response. Are you working with what we'll call a vanilla endpoint detection and response solution where there was a purchase made for licensing, it's got basic setup, and it's just out there across your network? Where is it across your network? Is it on servers, particularly sensitive servers? Is it deployed across the endpoints all across workstations and desktops? What policies are in place? Sometimes organizations find themselves in situations where maybe the EDR tool doesn't play very well with a custom-built application for their business, a homegrown tool, we could call it. So they just removed it. And now that becomes a potential risk where there's no protection whatsoever. And those are things that can be fine-tuned within the EDR as well. So when it comes down to the critical business infrastructure, enhancing that data security, there's a lot of things that can happen with regard to doing basic baselining, before anything would ever happen. And part of that comes down to some of the very, very basics that you see across NIST framework. Enforcing strong password policies. There's been some changes as it relates to how often they should be changed, how complex they should be. Implementing MFA again with enforcement where applicable. A lot of organizations may have accounts that have lived for years and years and years. John Smith retired 5 years ago and he's an admin and his account is still active. And sometimes people don't realize that until they suffer an incident. They go through and they do Active Directory audits and realize this was a compromised account. It should have never existed in the first place. So something to consider there. Some accounts may have default credentials. Those obviously want to be taken care of. Log aggregation is going to be a big deal in terms of that baselining. To the extent that something happens, or firewall logs or other perimeter devices, edge devices, are they being aggregated to somewhere? And where is that where? Is it within a SIM or a syslog server? Is data encrypted in transit? Is it encrypted at rest? Firewall permissions and configurations, network segmentation, obviously are all going to be important there as well. So we'll move forward. We've got one more polling question on the next slide. We may.
Polling question number 3. Which area is your organization most focused on improving post-incident? Single choice. Governance and risk management, attack surface reduction, identity and access management, or detection and response capabilities. I'll read that again. Which area is your organization most focused on improving post-incident? Single choice. First choice, governance and risk management. Second choice, Attack surface reduction, third choice. Identity and access management, and fourth choice, detection and response capabilities.
And there are no wrong answers here.
This will be an interesting one.
All right, we'll give it about 10 more seconds here. If you haven't already got your answer in, please do so now. And then after I close the polling question, I will share the results. All right, thank you guys. And then here are our results.
Excellent. That's great. That's very helpful.
Very helpful. All right. So as it relates to, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sean.
Chris, I was just going to jump on. We've got a lot of data to cover here, a lot of information. So, Chris, we're going to speak quickly because you guys can obviously think very quickly, but know that I think we're going to share this deck with you afterward as well, and if you'd like it. So we will be covering it if you don't have a chance to take notes. But we're going to talk kind of quickly. But these are all the security controls that might be that might potentially be applicable that we want to talk through and make sure they've got it enabled. Chris?
Yep. Thank you very much, Sean. So I talked a little bit about NIST. I won't go too deep into the weeds there. One of the things, of course, is going to be to ensure that your standard protocols allow for approved and denied software. One of the big things that we deal with all the time is living off the land tactics, whereby a threat actor comes in, they peruse the network, and they identify the tools that are already in the network that they can use, as opposed to bringing in their toolbox of hacker goodies and setting off all the bells and whistles. So alerting, system isolation, all those things are all capabilities within the EDR solutions. Being security conscious. I work with clients all the time and say, we took all of the recommendations that you gave and we talked to our insurance company about them, and come to find out they actually had discounts or, maybe separate service offerings for some of this phishing training and some of the other user-based training that you had talked with us about. So that's something that may be up for consideration as well. In terms of change management, kind of establishing what that group's going to look like and who's going to do what to the extent something happens, who's going to be running where, and are you prepared? Who's going to make those phone calls? We'll talk a little bit more about attack surface reduction on the next slide. So I know I covered this a little bit at high level, where essentially there would be scanning from the outside of the network. On the outside of that, there's also the ability to go through and do dark web monitoring, whereby there's constant monitoring for specific keywords. Who are your organization's DBAs? Are there corporations or LLCs or other names tied to that? What are specific keywords that may target hits for your specific data? By extension, enhancing some of that vulnerability management. What does the vulnerability look like? What is your vulnerability or patch management process look like? How often is that happening? Industry standard is about quarterly. Oftentimes it should be monthly. And I'm going to say something that could be very controversial here. Could be a good idea to sign up for those email blasts. If you're working with specific vendors and you're worried about zero-day attacks, for the incident responders, there's oftentimes, hey, this is our 13th scoping call today for the same exact thing. It sounds like this is the latest 0-day. Sometimes that happens long before the vendors even know about it. And then there's other clients that come to us and it's like, sir or ma'am, this is a vulnerability that's been out for 6 months. Oh, we never knew. Had they gotten that information from the email that's coming out from those vendors, that may have been helpful as well. So something for consideration. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about hardening. So in hardening the networks, obviously reviewing backup policies. Backups are great. There's a lot of talk about immutable backups. One of the things that we're seeing right now is the threat actors are targeting those backups, but they're immutable. They're not going to get overwritten, but we're actually finding where they're factory resetting the devices that they live on. So, air gapping is always going to be a thing. No matter what, that's probably going to be, the invincible backups that you have. And that's a whole other discussion there. But, just as Sean mentioned, backups are going to be very important. What impact is that going to have? There should also be a lot of consideration in terms of timing. How much time do we have? If we have, fill in the blank terabytes or petabytes worth of data, how long is it going to take for data migration to restore those into a newly segregated, clean environment? So part of the baselining we talked about already, I won't talk too much about that. But network segmentation is also going to be very important. You've got VLANs, firewalls. A lot of organizations do a very good job with preserving their data and aggregating it maybe to a syslog server. But that syslog server with the same segmentation in mind doesn't happen. So if and when those attacks occur, the threat actors can laterally move over to those systems on the syslog. It's not separated by a VLAN. It's not segmented from Active Directory. So that's going to be a consideration as well moving forward to ensure that if and when there needs to be an audit trail for review to go back and look at logs that have been aggregated, that they haven't been compromised there. So a little bit more about ESXi, and I won't dive too deep into this because this might be PowerPoint overkill with the technical details, but we'll talk a little bit about ESXi and hardening there. So a number of different things for ESXi, obviously upgrading, keeping up with patch management, enhancing any default password policy. Years past, there were default passwords. Now, in today's day and even years past, there's going to be an actual setup, but you want that to be, secure in terms of the passwords. Utilizing all of the latest and greatest, disabling any remote access, shell as a way the threat actors can take action and make commands on the systems, removing that, enforcing some of the multi-factor that can be put in place across vSphere, and ensuring that only applications that are signed, by known organizations can actually be run. And look, malware is unsigned, so that can help eliminate a lot of badness there. And then obviously removing Active Directory as an LDAP authentication source is one other method. There's a lot that can be unpacked here, but I know that we want to be very cautious of time. So moving into some of the identity and access management, Active Directory permissions are going to be a thing. I talked about, the folks that work in the cafeteria at the school and having access to, student education records, for example. Conducting these Active Directory audits is going to be very important, especially if you've got an organization where, people are coming in, maybe they're moving or transferring in terms of their roles, lateral movements, people that are retired and moving on to other, opportunities. It'd be very important to keep an eye on this and what accounts might be the sitting duck. Keeping zero trust, of course, in mind is also going to be a top priority. In addition to some of the other capabilities, looking at what the password hygiene policy is. Are there passwords that haven't been reset since 10 years ago that are basic passwords that are, a letter and a few numbers? And then obviously multi-factor across the board as well. So in terms of enhancing detection and response on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about kind of going through the firewall logging, aggregating anything ESXi, anything that could be log aggregated, edge devices, firewall. We talked a little bit about that. Some people may ask, well, what's the difference between the syslog and the SIEM? Do we really need both? From a security perspective, that is a business decision. The syslog is going to have all of the information that's been aggregated, all of that log data. And then the SIEM, of course, helps kind of translate, well, what does all this mean? What risk is this? What exactly is happening? And what does this translate to? From a defense in-depth perspective, having both of them is going to be good. But again, that's a business decision in the end. When it comes down to operations management, there are some other considerations there as it relates to who's going to be doing that work. Are we going to be monitoring all of this stuff on-prem? Are we going to have a third party that's going to be reviewing this for us? A lot of our attackers like to attack during known U.S. holidays. Are there going to be folks around on, the biggest holidays of the year to take action, review alerts, peruse logs to see what's happening, what accounts are getting changed, and what's happening there? So in terms of the detection and response with EDRs, obviously we want to beef those up as much as possible. Any policies that you have should stay updated, and then be 24/7. So there's the endpoint, the detection, and the response is the most critical piece to all of that. There's so many cases. Sean, go ahead.
Oh, Chris, I was just going to say, this might be a way to approach it too. I know you and I have recently in a number of matters where supply chain component parts are affected. Third-party vendors are affected. Key component parts of an information security program are affected because they're the third party managing somebody's information security, right? And so we want to make sure that as part of the due diligence for those third parties, that you actually have a due diligence program in place and the ability to on at least an annual basis kind of audit the security posture of those vendors that you've engaged and to make sure that they're doing what they are supposed to be doing. I know it sounds crazy that might not happen, but oftentimes we hop into something and realize that, gosh, a portion of those EDR, those endpoint detection and response agents, weren't actually deployed to the entire network. And that part of the network that wasn't covered was hit. Or G, maybe multi-factor authentication that was supposed to be deployed to major applications. Well, it wasn't really fully deployed. And sure enough, those applications got hit. So we just want to make sure that if you've got third-party providers, and we all do, in this day and age, we're living in digital environments, and we need a number of parties and component parts, not just software and firmware, but we need other entities to actually help us with our data. Sometimes data management, sometimes data storage, sometimes data security. We want to make sure they're doing their job. And you're paying them for a service. Make sure they have the ability to regularly audit that, in fact, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, because oftentimes they are the pain point, and they're going to be the weak link in the chain. Chris?
No, that's all good points. And one other thing that I know that you and I have seen a lot in our careers, Sean, is the fact that a lot of companies have all these things in place, but all of this is being self-monitored. So there's not, potentially the training that's needed to be able to identify things. There's alert overload, alert exhaustion. There's thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of alerts that are coming through. And sometimes that can be very difficult for the folks on the ground that are, manually looking through these to try to differentiate what's a false positive versus what is actually a legitimate threat. So, all right, moving on to our next slide, enhanced data security. So when we talk about the policy standards, data classifications, obviously conducting these scans to discover where does this sensitive data actually live? Are there data sets in different areas of the network that nobody ever knew about? Are there copies of those data sets? What policies, to the extent there are any, classify kind of where they are? Are those data sets tagged? What does your data retention policy look like? Most importantly, do you have data that you don't need from 15 years ago? And I know, Sean, that's something that you and I have talked about a lot during some of these engagements. And what data loss prevention or DLP policies are in place with some of the SIM and SOAR tools that we've talked about here. Centralized logging, whether it's on site or out in the cloud, and being able to identify what those business goals are. And Sean, I know this is more related to the legal side with respect to GDPR, HIPAA, and PII, so I might pass this part over to you.
No, I mean, the part when to go back to data classification policy, one of the things there is data security or data retention policies are becoming far more important than they ever have been before, and really need to be at the forefront of part of your information security program. Sometimes they've been maybe in a risk management program, maybe someplace else, but it really needs to be a part and parcel of your information security program, because you don't want to have any data that you don't need. If you do have data that you need, you want to make sure it's secure. But we got to go through looking at all the data you have, identify where it resides, how it's secured, and making sure if you're obligated to keep it, why you're obligated to keep it. Is it because of contractual obligations? Is it because of regulatory obligations? What is the reason you're keeping it? Because if you don't have a reason, you may not want to keep it, because it's a source of liability every single time, and that's going to be a key part of it. With regard to data loss prevention, Chris, is that if you're transitioning it to me there? We obviously, in terms of properly securing the data, and then obviously in creating your data retention policy, you need to know what kind of data it is. Is it personal information that's regulated by statute? Is it personal information that's regulated by contract? Is it protected health information, as opposed to what we see as typical personal information, meaning SSN or a driver's license number or a financial account with the means to access that account? Or is it something else that's regulated by statute, meaning a health insurance policy, medical information, biometric information? All those things are typically data sets that are measured by or regulated by statute, which would be part of the definitions that trigger your incident response team under your incident response plan. But we want to make sure that you're looking at that stuff and making sure that we have the ability to alert and detect anybody accessing and acquiring those data sets without authorization. Chris?
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. But when it comes to some of this, obviously, when we're doing the incident response, whether it's U.S. based, UK based, maybe international incident where it's multiple countries altogether, GDPR obviously is going to change things from an incident responder perspective. Who's going to be where? Where does that data live? Who's connecting to what? Who has access to that data? So these are all very important considerations that we'll take into account during and after those processes. most importantly, where does that data live? And again, who's got the access to it is going to be most
Right.
important.
And to the extent your business model extends to other jurisdictions as well, you just every time that happens, you need somebody to analyze what your obligations are there for. If you're an e-commerce site and people from all the world are going to be able to access that and buy stuff and use payment card, maybe leave personal information in your system itself. Got to make sure you're aware of where they are and what your obligations might be, because we have had matters where you've got literally almost 100 different countries are affected based on their data privacy and security laws are affected. And many of them have different approaches to that whole consumer or regulatory notification process and timing and content. So it's really critical for you at the outset, outside the crisis, before anything occurs, as you start to ingest the data, as you start to merge and acquire other businesses, make sure that any jurisdictions that you're now doing business in that you weren't before, that you identify what your obligations are under those systems so you don't create liability along the way. You're actually mitigating the risk of that liability.
Very well said.
And with that, I thought we were really going to be challenged to get through all of that. I know it's a fire hose worth of information, which is probably why we spoke a little more quickly than we might have otherwise. But there may be questions that people want to ask in the chat, and I know I'm going to go back to that excellent question that was asked about before in terms of out-of-band communication. I know someone suggested maybe it was Signal or Slack, and one of the things we want to consider when we go to out-of-band communication is the ability to not just really fully utilize it efficiently. I mean, it's got to be usually a familiar platform like a typical email communication might be, but also the ability to preserve it. And so the trouble is when you're using secure apps like Signal, Slack, and others, they may be really good for information technology on the fly, but they're not very good for preservation and maybe to defend yourself if you actually get sued. So we want to make sure we have the ability to actually identify what we've communicated about, with whom we've communicated, and then capture that and preserve that, because that actually you might need that to defend yourself. And if you're using a secure app that's otherwise good for certain types of communication, like Signal, Slack, and others, the challenge is you're probably not going to be able to preserve that and defend yourself with it, because it's going to have a deletion period that you've probably properly set, or at least it's not going to be you're not going to be able to aggregate it like you would otherwise, and make sure you're able to use it to your advantage. Just a thought. That's one of the reasons we actually do typically fall over to personal emails that are created specific to the incident. And for instance, if something happened today, you might label it your last name, and then followed by the name of your business, maybe one name of your business, and the date. Maybe it'd be Chris Booz 2026. Maybe that would be his instant domain, then his name and address convention for his personal email address at whatever domain you've got there. And then everybody in his organization might do the same thing: the last name, business name, date, something like that. Or you could do it some more than numerical naming convention. But typically, we want that to be efficient as well, so we're able to identify who we're communicating with, making sure those who are logging on to a video call, for instance, are those who are authorized to log on. And oftentimes, it's that initial moniker through an email domain that's going to help us identify that too, as well as the roll call we take every time we're on a cadence call. Chris?
No, I completely agree. And the out-of-band emails are so very important for all of those reasons. It's also nice to be able to have all of that funneled to those out-of-band email addresses where, for the most part, it's typically business as usual with regard to the email communications for business purposes. So to keep all of that isolated, you know where to go. It's all in the same place all the time. You're not, scouring through your corporate email accounts trying to find out what the latest update is from the cyber attorneys or the incident responders.
Yeah. And so I'm not sure if you're doing chat, but if you want a copy of the slide deck, go ahead and email Madison Christie at mchristie, that's MCHRISTIE at Constangy.com. mchristie at Constangy.com, and she'll be glad to provide you a copy of the deck. And if there are any last questions, we'd love to take those. And otherwise, we really thank you for the honor of your time this morning. Thank you very much for spending it with us. We hope this was valuable to you, and we look forward to any insights you may want to share with us after the fact.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sean, for presenting, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, privilege. Go forth and have a wonderful day wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you.